My name is Caroline Voss. I'm 34 years old. And 18 months ago, my husband told a therapist I had never met that I was struggling with something he called emotional volatility. He'd already booked 6 sessions before I knew the appointments existed. I want to walk through how this happened slowly because that's the only honest way to tell it. Nothing about my marriage to Eric looked alarming from the outside, not for years. It looked, by most measures, like stable, comfortable. The kind of relationship people sometimes describe a little enviously as easy. I met Eric when I was 26 at a mutual friend's barbecue in Charlotte. He worked in commercial real estate, methodical and confident in a way I found grounding at the time, especially after a string of relationships with men who seemed allergic to making any decision at all. Eric always knew what he wanted. He proposed after 2 years with a 5-year plan already sketched out in his head: house, kids, the trajectory of a life mapped with the same precision he brought to his deals at work. I found that precision reassuring in the beginning. I didn't yet understand how it could curdle into something else. The marriage was good for the first several years. We bought a house. We had 2 children, Lily, now 6, and Sam, now 4. I'd worked as a graphic designer before the kids, freelancing from home after Lily was born, building a modest but steady client base that let me contribute financially while also being present for the kids in the ways I wanted to be. The friction started, I think, around the time Sam turned 2. It's hard to identify a single moment because it built so gradually, the way most slow erosions do. I was exhausted in the particular way that comes from caring for 2 small children while also trying to maintain a freelance career, and I started expressing that exhaustion more openly than I had in earlier years. I'd get frustrated when Eric came home late without warning, leaving me solo with bedtime for both kids after I'd already worked a full day. I'd raise my voice sometimes, not often, but more than I used to. I'd cry more easily than I had in my 20s, the particular fragility that comes from chronic sleep deprivation and very little time to be anything other than someone's mother. Eric started calling these moments episodes. It began casually, almost as a joke. "Here we go again," he'd say with a small laugh if I got upset about something: dishes left undone, a missed commitment, feeling unsupported during a hard week. The first few times I laughed along with him, assuming he was just teasing, the way couples sometimes tease each other about familiar patterns. But the comments accumulated. They started showing up in front of other people, at dinners with friends, at his sister's house during a holiday gathering, always delivered lightly, always with that same small laugh that made it seem unreasonable to object. "Caroline gets a little intense sometimes," he'd say, almost fondly, the way you might describe someone's quirky habit rather than something that should concern anyone. I started to internalize it before I fully recognized I was doing so. I began second-guessing my own reactions to things, wondering if my frustration over real, concrete problems, an unequal division of household labor, feeling unseen during an exhausting stretch of early parenting, was actually proportionate, or if I was, as Eric increasingly implied, simply too much. About a year ago, things escalated in a way I didn't fully understand until much later. Eric came home one evening and told me, in the careful, gentle tone he used when he wanted something to land softly, that he'd been doing some research and thought it might help me to talk to someone. A therapist. Just to have an outlet, he said. Just to process some of the stress of motherhood and the business of running a household. I want to be honest that I didn't reject this idea outright. I had in fact been considering therapy on my own, separate from anything. The exhaustion of those years was real. The isolation that comes with early parenting, especially when you're also trying to maintain professional work, is genuinely hard, and I had wondered privately whether talking to someone might help me feel less alone in it. So when Eric suggested it, framed as concern rather than accusation, I said I'd think about it. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing at the time, was that Eric had already done considerably more than simply suggest the idea. He had already contacted a therapist directly, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hale, who specialized, according to her practice's website, in mood regulation and emotional stabilization for women navigating major life transitions. He had described our marital dynamics to her over the phone, in a consultation call I knew nothing about, characterizing my behavior in terms that, I would later learn, painted a picture considerably more alarming than the reality of an exhausted mother of 2 trying to keep a freelance career afloat while feeling unsupported by her husband. He told Dr. Hale in that initial consultation that I experienced unpredictable mood swings, that I had difficulty regulating my emotions, that he was concerned about the impact my instability might be having on our children. He used at one point during that call the word hysteria, Not clinically, not as an actual diagnosis, since hysteria hasn't been a recognized medical condition in any legitimate sense for decades. But colloquially, the way people sometimes still use the word to dismiss women's emotional responses as inherently excessive or unreasonable. He booked 6 initial sessions for me before I had agreed to attend a single one. I found this out eventually. About 3 weeks after our conversation about therapy, Eric mentioned, casually over dinner, that he'd gone ahead and set something up with a therapist he'd researched, someone he thought would be a good fit. He said it the way you might mention you'd booked a dentist appointment for someone else as a thoughtful gesture, as though scheduling someone's mental health treatment without consulting them first was an act of caring rather than control. I remember feeling something uncomfortable flicker through me at that moment, though I couldn't immediately articulate why. You already booked something? I asked, without talking to me about which therapist or whether I'd even agreed to start. I just wanted to make it easy for you, he said. I know you're stretched thin. I figured if I handled the logistics, you'd actually follow through instead of letting it fall to the bottom of your list. I want to explain why this didn't immediately register as the violation it actually was. Eric had a long history of handling logistics in our marriage in ways that, on the surface, looked like helpfulness, booking our family vacations, scheduling the kids' pediatrician appointments, managing our finances in a system he'd built, and I'd never fully learned because he always seemed to have it handled. I had, over years of marriage, gradually ceded a significant amount of administrative control to him, not because I was incapable, but because it was easier, in the daily grind of parenting and freelancing, to let him manage what he seemed eager to manage. This felt, at first, like an extension of that same pattern, just applied to something more personal. I agreed to attend the first session, mostly out of curiosity, partly out of genuine openness to the idea of therapy, and partly, I'll admit now, out of a creeping unease I hadn't yet found words for. The first session with Dr. Hale was, I remember, slightly strange in a way I couldn't fully name at the time. She asked me a series of questions that felt subtly leading questions about my temper, about whether I'd ever felt out of control of my emotions, about whether my mother or grandmother had ever exhibited similar patterns, as though she were searching for confirmation of something she already believed to be true rather than approaching me with genuine curiosity. I answered honestly. I told her I got frustrated sometimes, particularly around issues of fairness in our house. I told her I'd been more tearful than usual in the past year, which I attributed clearly and specifically to chronic exhaustion and feeling unsupported, not to any underlying instability. I told her I didn't think I had a problem regulating my emotions so much as a problem getting my husband to actually hear me when I expressed frustration about concrete, fixable issues. Dr. Hale nodded along, took notes, but something about her questions kept circling back to a narrative I hadn't presented, implications about volatility, about unpredictability, language that didn't match anything I'd actually said or felt. I left that first session feeling unsettled rather than helped, though I couldn't fully articulate why for several more weeks. The unease crystallized about a month later, during what should have been a routine fourth session. I arrived a few minutes early and was sitting in Dr. Hale's small waiting room when I overheard, through a door that wasn't fully closed, the tail end of a phone conversation Dr. Hale was apparently having before our session began. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I simply happened to be sitting close enough to hear fragments of what was clearly a call with Eric, scheduling what sounded like a separate consultation, this one without me present. I heard her say something like, I understand your concerns about her stability, and I think the sessions are helping us build a clearer picture. I sat very still in that waiting room, feeling something cold settle into my chest. When I went in for my session, I asked Dr. Hale directly whether she had ongoing, separate communication with Eric about my treatment. She paused, clearly weighing how to answer, before confirming that yes, Eric had reached out periodically to share what he described as additional context about incidents at home, information he felt was relevant to my treatment, but that he worried I might not disclose accurately myself, given what he characterized as my tendency to minimize or rationalize my own behavior. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage while my hands were shaking slightly in my lap, what exactly Eric had been telling her. She said she wasn't able to share the specific content of those communications without breaching confidentiality protocols related to him as a third party, but she acknowledged that his reports had factored into her overall clinical impression of my situation. I left that session and sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I want to explain what happened in my mind during those 20 minutes because I think it matters. I wasn't immediately angry. I was instead deeply confused, trying to understand how a husband who had always presented himself as supportive, who handled logistics, who seemed genuinely invested in our family's well-being, could simultaneously be constructing a narrative about me behind closed doors, feeding a therapist information designed, whether consciously or not, to paint me as unstable. I started, in the weeks that followed, paying closer attention to patterns I had previously. The way Eric would reframe arguments after the fact, describing my reactions as more extreme than I remembered them being. The way he'd sometimes say, during disagreements, "You're doing it again," in a tone that implied a documented ongoing pattern rather than a single moment of frustration. The way he seemed to keep a kind of running internal ledger of my emotional responses, ready to produce evidence of my supposed instability whenever it served him. I started to wonder, with a sick feeling I couldn't quite shake, whether Eric had been building this narrative for far longer than the few months since I'd started seeing Dr. Hale. I decided about 6 weeks into the therapy arrangement that I needed actual documentation of what was happening, not just my own increasingly unsettled instincts. I went to my 5th scheduled session, and before we began, I told Dr. Hale directly that given the unusual circumstances of my treatment, the fact that my husband had initiated it, that he had ongoing separate contact with her about my supposed condition, I wanted our session recorded with her consent as a matter of my own protection and clarity going forward. This is, I should explain, fairly standard practice that many therapists accommodate when a client requests it, particularly for clients who want a record to review later or who, for whatever reason, want documentation of what is actually discussed in session versus what might later be characterized differently by someone else. Dr. Hale, to her credit, agreed without significant hesitation. She explained the practice's standard protocol around recorded sessions, that recordings were used for clinical review purposes, and that clients could request copies under specific circumstances, particularly if there was a legitimate need related to legal or personal documentation. She had me sign a consent form acknowledging the recording, which she noted was stored securely and accessible to me upon request, given the unusual circumstances I'd described. I didn't fully know at that point what I was going to do with a recorded session. I just knew, with a clarity that felt important even though I couldn't fully articulate the reasoning, that I needed something concrete, something that existed outside the increasingly disorienting back and forth between what I remembered happening and what Eric seemed to be telling everyone else had happened. That 5th session became, without my fully planning it, the moment everything changed. About 20 minutes in, while we were discussing a recent disagreement Eric and I had about household responsibilities, Dr. Hale asked me a question that finally made the entire pattern click into place. "Eric mentioned that during your argument last week you threw a plate. Can you tell me about that?" I sat in stunned silence for a moment. "I never threw a plate," I said. "There was no plate involved in that argument at all." Dr. Hale looked moment. "He described a specific incident," she said carefully. "Last Tuesday, an argument about the dishwasher where he said you became upset enough to throw a plate against the wall." I felt something shift in my chest, a kind of clarity arriving alongside genuine fear. "Dr. Hale, I need you to understand something," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Last Tuesday, Eric and I had a disagreement about the dishwasher because he'd left dirty dishes in the sink for 3 days despite repeatedly saying he'd handle it." I raised my voice. I told him I was frustrated and felt unsupported. I did not throw anything. There was no plate. There was no violence of any kind, verbal or physical, beyond me expressing frustration in a normal, if heated, tone. The recording, which I requested and received a copy of shortly afterward, captured all of this exactly as I'm describing it. My account, clear and specific, directly contradicting a story Eric had apparently told Dr. Hale about an incident that simply never happened the way he described it. I want to pause here and explain why this single moment mattered so enormously, beyond the immediate shock of hearing a fabricated story repeated back to me as established. It was the first piece of concrete, recorded evidence that Eric wasn't simply exaggerating my reactions in the way people sometimes unfairly characterize a partner during an argument. He was actively constructing entirely fictional events, dramatic incidents that hadn't occurred at all, and feeding them to a licensed mental health professional who was, understandably, incorporating that information into her clinical understanding of my supposed condition. I asked Dr. Hale, directly and as calmly as I could manage, how many other incidents Eric had described to her that I hadn't been present for or hadn't been asked to confirm. She pulled up her notes, visibly uncomfortable now, and read through a list that included 3 other incidents I had never been consulted about: a supposed outburst at family dinner, where I'd allegedly screamed at his mother, an incident where I'd supposedly thrown my phone during an argument about finances, and a claim that I had, on one occasion, locked myself in the bathroom for several hours in what he described as a dissociative episode in front of our children. None of these things had happened. Not one of them, not even in a distorted or exaggerated version of an actual event. They were, as far as I could determine, entirely fabricated, constructed narratives designed to build a case for something Eric apparently wanted Dr. Hale, and presumably others, to believe about me. I left that session and drove directly to a different attorney's office, not my regular family lawyer, someone unconnected to Eric's professional network, a woman named Renata Cole, who specialized in family law with a particular focus on cases involving manipulation and coercive control within marriages. I brought the recording. I brought my own detailed timeline of the actual events Eric had apparently misrepresented. I explained the entire situation, from the initial casual comments about my episodes years earlier, through the unconsented therapy booking, through the discovery of separate communications with Dr. Hale, to the fabricated incidents I'd just learned about. Renata listened to the recording in her office, taking careful notes, her expression growing increasingly serious as she absorbed what I was describing. "This is significant," she said, when I'd finished. "What you're describing has a name in family law circles, though it's not always formally recognized in every jurisdiction. It's a pattern sometimes called medical or psychiatric gaslighting, deliberately constructing a false record of someone's mental instability, often through manipulating third-party professionals, in order to gain leverage or control, particularly in situations that might eventually involve custody disputes or other legal proceedings." I felt something cold move through me at the word custody. "Do you think that's what he's planning?" I asked. "I don't know his intentions with certainty," Renata said. "But I think you need to understand the seriousness of what's been documented here, and you need to start protecting yourself accordingly, regardless of whether divorce or custody proceedings are imminent or simply a future possibility." Over the following weeks, working closely with Renata, I began the careful, methodical process of documenting everything I could. I requested my complete therapy file from Dr. Hale's office, which, under patient access laws, I was entitled to receive. The file confirmed everything the recording had revealed, detailed notes from Eric's separate phone calls and in-person meetings with Dr. Hale, several of which had occurred without my knowledge, containing increasingly elaborate descriptions of incidents that simply hadn't happened. I also discovered, going through old emails I'd never had reason to search before, that Eric had been building this case for considerably longer than I'd realized. There were emails to his brother, dating back almost 2 years, casually mentioning his concerns about my mental health in language that mirrored, almost exactly, the terminology he'd later use with Dr. Hale. There was a single email to a divorce attorney, sent over a year before any of our current conflict became visible to me, asking general questions about custody considerations in cases involving a parent with documented emotional instability. I sat with that email for a long time, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost like physical pain, that Eric had been quietly constructing a legal and clinical case against me for the better part of 2 years, long before I had any conscious awareness that anything in our marriage was fundamentally wrong. I confronted him directly once Renata, and I had gathered enough documentation to understand the full scope of what had happened. I told him I knew about the separate communications with Dr. Hale. I told him I'd seen the email to the divorce attorney from over a year earlier. Eric's response was, in its own way, almost as revealing as everything I'd already discovered. He didn't deny the specific facts. He couldn't, given the documentation I had. Instead, he tried to reframe the entire pattern as concern, as protective foresight, as a husband simply trying to prepare for a worst-case scenario he genuinely believed might come to pass. "I was scared," he said. "I've watched you get more and more unstable for years, and I didn't know what else to do except try to document it, try to get professional opinions, try to protect the kids in case things got worse." "I never threw a plate, Eric," I said. I never locked myself in the bathroom for hours. None of those things happened, you made them up." "Maybe I exaggerated some details," he admitted after a long silence. "But the underlying pattern is real, Caroline. You do get volatile. You do struggle to control your emotions." I told him, as steadily as I could manage, that being frustrated about an unequal division of household labor, about feeling unsupported during years of exhausting early parenting, was not the same thing as emotional instability, and that fabricating specific, dramatic incidents to a licensed therapist in order to build a clinical record against me was not protective concern. It was, in the plainest possible terms, a calculated attempt at control. We are currently in the early stages of a divorce. Renata has been instrumental in ensuring that the recorded session, along with the full therapy file and the email correspondence I uncovered, are properly documented and preserved as part of the legal proceedings, specifically to counter any future attempt by Eric to use a manufactured narrative about my mental stability in custody discussions. Dr. Hale, for her part, has been cooperative throughout this process in a way I genuinely appreciate, given how complicated her position became once the fabrications came to light. She's provided a formal statement acknowledging that several incidents reported to her by Eric were directly contradicted by my own account during recorded sessions, and that she had no independent way of verifying his claims at the time she incorporated them into her clinical notes. I think about that fifth session often, the almost accidental decision to request recording, born more out of a vague, unsettled instinct than any clear strategic plan. I think about how differently things might have unfolded if I hadn't made that request. If Eric's fabricated story about a thrown plate had simply entered my clinical record unchallenged, becoming part of an official, documented account of incidents that never actually happened. The custody of The divorce itself is still working through the courts. None of this is fully resolved, and I don't yet know exactly what our shared custody arrangement for Lily and Sam will ultimately look like. What I do know, with a certainty that feels hard-won and important, is that I am no longer the only person who knows the actual truth of what happened in our marriage. I have a recording. I have documentation. I have a therapist's own acknowledgement that the narrative she'd been given didn't match the actual evidence once that evidence finally existed in recorded, verifiable form. I think about all the years before that fifth session, all the small moments where I quietly absorbed the suggestion that my normal, reasonable frustrations were actually evidence of some deeper instability. All the times I second-guessed my own memory of events, because Eric described them with such calm, confident certainty that it felt easier to doubt myself than to doubt him. I don't doubt myself in that particular way anymore. Not because the underlying exhaustion and frustration of those years has disappeared: divorce, single co-parenting, rebuilding a sense of professional and personal stability after everything that happened. All of that remains genuinely hard. But I no longer carry the additional, corrosive weight of wondering whether my own perception of reality can be trusted. I have a recording that proves it can. I am 34 years old. I am in the process of ending a marriage I once believed was simply ordinary, comfortable, and good. I am the mother of 2 children I am fighting, carefully and methodically, to protect from a narrative that was never true. And I have learned, in the most disorienting way possible, that sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are actually building a case against you, one quiet, fabricated detail at a time, hoping you never think to ask for the recording that would prove otherwise.